Hi everyone, my name is Vlad. I'm going to be presenting for the Mindfulness and Meditation dissertation writing workshop. Hopefully, this presentation will give you some tips and tricks and tools to use to make writing your dissertation more enjoyable rather than stressful. I've been there, I know what it's like. It can be a very tough time, and meditation can definitely be a tool to help you there. So, yeah, let's get right into it. So, I think the most useful thing to do is to define what meditation is. So I will do this from my background of cognitive science, which reunites multiple different fields and disciplines. So it's going to be a very interdisciplinary discussion of meditation, looking at multiple different benefits from very different areas. This is what most people think about when they see meditation, but I'm here to tell you that it's not necessarily this. So that is indeed meditation, but it's not the only thing that meditation is. And let's track back a bit and think about what mindfulness is. So this guy on the left is John Kabat-Zinn. He's considered the founding father of mindfulness meditation in the West. So he opened up the clinic at MIT, and he's really kind of pioneered the idea of studying meditation and mindfulness-based therapies. And this is how he defines it. He says meditation or mindfulness is awareness that arises through paying attention on purpose in the present moment, non-judgmentally, in the service of self-understanding and wisdom. Okay, that's a pretty cool definition. We also have Siddhartha Gautama, the Buddha, one of the original influencers when it comes to meditation and mindfulness. And what he said a while back was, if a man's thoughts are muddy, if he is reckless and full of deceit, how can he wear the yellow robe? Whoever is master of his own nature, bright, clear, and true, he may indeed wear the yellow robe. So this sort of relates that if you want to be successful in life, in this context, yellow robe would mean to be a monk. But if you want to be successful in life or happy in life, you would need to not have muddy thoughts, so not be confused, not be overwhelmed by what's going on in the inside, not be reckless, not be deceived, and just sort of master yourself clearly and brightly. Okay, this should give us an idea of what meditation is. But it's actually quite difficult to define meditation, especially when it comes to actual scientific interventions, because when we're trying to measure what an intervention does and compare across studies, we want to have a streamlined um, intervention. But there's so many different types of meditations, and there's so many different ways to bring about a status of meditating that it can actually be quite complicated. So according to this paper from 2009, there's a persistent lack of consensus about what meditation is, and it actually seems kind of impossible to define meditation clearly. So many people use meditation or yogic-based interventions as a term. I will just stick with meditation for simplicity, but it's important to know this caveat when going into this presentation. So then maybe it might be easier to define what isn't meditation. So a lot of people say, "Oh, running is my meditation," or "This sport is my meditation," and that's not necessarily true. And this also works for more intellectual games or stuff. So you wouldn't be able to say that chess is your meditation or reading is your meditation. So really, a state of flow is not meditation. So these things can bring about a state of flow, a state of unruptured focus, but that's not meditation. And what I can certainly say is that meditation can help you achieve the state of unruptured flow and focus in other activities. But achieving that state in other activities will not mean that you're meditating or will not improve trying to reach focus in other activities, if that makes sense. So then let's try and explore maybe a rough definition of what mindfulness and meditation is. And I think it's pretty easy to describe it in using the terms that the Buddha and John Kabat-Zinn used. So it's an inquiry, almost a scientific inquiry. Imagine you're a scientist trying to explore in their laboratory and observe exactly what is happening. You're doing this with curiosity, but most importantly, you're doing this with compassion. So what arises, you're not trying to shun it away or judge it, or there's no right or wrong. There really isn't. It just is. You're just observing what comes up. And the reason you're doing this is for knowledge. It's to gain insight into yourself. Is to learn about the self and about the nature of the world. And through this, you may hope to also alleviate some of your own suffering and distress. Um, okay, so where does meditation come from? And this is actually where things get a bit more interesting because some people, like this guy, who is a very renowned cognitive scientist and psychologist, believe that meditating actually made us human. And this is their arguments for it. So he gives these 5 points. I'm going to go from bottom to top just because it might be a bit easier to understand. So back about a couple thousand years ago, tens of thousands of years ago, we used to sit around in a circle and look at the fire. And this is a sort of act of meditating. In his paper, Rosano defines it as hypnotizability, and he says that was actually conducive to survival. And there's a few papers to back that up as well. And this hypnotizability slash meditation that people would participate in around the fire is sort of effective on improving working memory. And we'll get a bit into that later. But specifically, people used to meditate around the fire, and meditating around the fire improves your working memory through Baldwinian selection, which is essentially when you change your environment or change your activities very drastically, you change your genes. So, for example, if all of us were to suddenly move to the top of Mount Everest, we would evolve very quickly to be adapted to that height and those temperatures, or we would just die. And the thesis here is that through this sitting around a fire and meditating, we've sort of improved our working memory and sort of forced our genes to catch up with that. And as a result of this genetic mutation, we've further enhanced our working memory. So it's sort of a loop, a circle. And then because of better working memory, we were able to actually create symbols and ritual symbolism and that kind of stuff, which, oops, sorry for about that notification, which can only come about with an extended and strong working memory. So this is the argument for why meditating actually potentially made us human. Some people don't buy it. I think it's quite interesting, and this paper is rather short and very easy to understand. So I strongly recommend people to go in and read it if they're interested. Now let's move a bit still in this direction and look at philosophy and theology. So actually, every single major religion has some sort of practice that is remarkable and similar to meditation. And I'm not just talking about prayer. So even if you ignore prayer, you would have in Christianity and in Islam and in Judaism some practices that are actually quite close, if not just meditation. And the reason you would do this in any of the world's major faiths is to attain love and compassion for self or God, um, to attain a deeper understanding of the world or the self, to relax. And I like to put it like an extension of the time between the stimulus and reaction. So what's happening is you get a stimulus from the world, and we tend to react pretty instantaneously. The more you meditate, the more you're able to extend the period between that stimulus and that reaction. And that means you can, instead of using reactivity, you can respond. You can respond in a way that's conducive to your goals. And also, the idea is supposed to attain a transcendence of your current state or condition and be more present in the now. So now I'd like to go to the more interesting aspect, in my opinion, because I'm quite fascinated by neuroscience and psychology. So on the left here, you can see the main regions that are affected in the brain when meditating. I'm not trying to give an intense neuroscientific talk, so don't try to stress too much over the terms. The most important parts are these parts here, near the prefrontal cortex. So that is the prefrontal cortex, and there's certain like little aspects of it that we might focus in a bit more. And then the amygdala. So these two regions are quite important for our exploration, and both of them have a component in mindfulness meditation. And what mindfulness meditation really relates to is three main types of control: attention control, emotional regulation, and self-awareness, all of which are the higher cognitive capability of self-regulation. We're going to explore a bit more in the future slides, but also what would be important to note is the different stages that a meditator has. So initially, there's effortful doing, then in the end you sort of achieve this effortless being, which is why I kind of held off from initially from saying that only meditation is meditation, because when you reach an advanced stage, you are sort of able to keep mindful awareness at all times because you're simply effortless being. And that's a beautiful thing to experience because theoretically you sort of meditate at all times. You simply are present and mindful of everything that arises in a compassionate way. All right, that's a pretty big goal to have in mind. All of us can reach that, but many of us just want to enjoy life a bit more and not stress about dissertation work. And this is kind of what we're here more to discuss. So how can mindfulness help with emotional regulation? First of all, we should look at what emotional regulation is. So you have a stimulus in the world. There's an appraisal of that stimulus. That appraisal reaches a certain affective state, and then there's regulation. And what this means is you see a cheetah, you appraise that cheetah, and you identify how should I feel about this cheetah. I should feel fearful, anxious, this is danger, I need to run. And then you have a behavior as well. And in certain cases, you can regulate the emotions. So, for example, if you realize actually this is just a toy cheetah, it's not a real cheetah, you would perhaps try to use cognitive control to calm yourself down and to say to yourself, there's no reason to be anxious. There's not actually any danger here. And the reason that I use the example of the cheetah is because even though we live in a modern day world, we still have threats. And when we have threats, the brain doesn't see, oh, this is just a deadline. The brain sees this is a cheetah. And it kind of activates a very primal part of the brain, which simply deals with I have to fight or I have to flee or I have to somehow get rid of this danger. And it stifles a creative and enjoyable approach to meeting that deadline. Because realistically, working on a dissertation can be something fun, can be something enjoyable. It can really tap into your um, intelligence and your creativity, but oftentimes it doesn't because of the worry of the deadline. Now, there's a new model for emotional regulation, which is a bit better because here there's not just regulation, there's a cognitive control process that happens at every step of the way. So, at every step throughout this, you can intervene and control what's happening. And this is, I think, kind of how humans do this. So, you could, like, as you see in the left here, situation selection. So, you could cognitively control the stimuli you receive by avoiding certain situations. So, for example, if you're really worried about your dissertation deadline, you might just not go to university, for example, so that you don't have to deal with that stimuli. Now, the one that we're really focused on is the cognitive change and the response modulation, because that's where mindfulness can really help you achieve a nicer quality of life. So here you can reappraise how you feel about a stimuli, and you can also modulate the response that you're deploying to that stimuli. So to sort of identify how mindfulness can help here, we're going to do a case study of generalized anxiety disorder and major depressive disorder. So the most important things to look at is a staple of anxiety or generalized anxiety disorder is the fact that the amygdala here has stronger connections to the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, which is just a prefrontal cortical structure, than the ventromedial has to the amygdala. So this is a loop. And what happens in anxiety is that the loop from the amygdala to the cortex is stronger than the connections from the cortex to the amygdala. And we'll get into why that is relevant in a second. But this also kind of happens in major depressive disorder, specifically with the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. So we see that it has a lesser activation. It's not as active, it's not as persistent, even in resting states, even in activities. So you can see this here. So the control had a higher activation than the depressed, specifically for the DLPFC. The DLPFC is sort of related to focus and attention as well, and motivation. The amygdala is related to appraising specifically fearful or aversive stimuli. So when you see something you should be scared of, the amygdala will be popping off. That's it's telling you that there is something in the environment that might be dangerous for you. You need to be careful right now. And obviously, we live in a very intense world, and there's plenty of things that could seem dangerous. So then we kind of evolved to have this region of the brain called the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, which sometimes just tells the amygdala, actually, it's okay. There's nothing really bad right now. You got to chill out. And when you have generalized anxiety disorder, this system is completely disrupted, and the prefrontal cortex isn't as strong, and it can't tell the amygdala, hey, we're actually fine. And then the amygdala sort of loops out. and keeps telling you something's wrong, and you're looking for what's wrong, and it might be the dissertation deadline, or it might be nothing. You might actually be fine, but you just feel intense anxiety, and that's essentially what's happening there. Um, but this is where meditation can help. So, and I hate to do this, I hate to have walls of text, but this is a compilation of some main points of a bunch of studies and how mindfulness has helped with regards to emotional regulation. So we have reduction of emotional interference by unpleasant or unwanted stimuli. So this is pretty cool because that means you have something you don't like in the environment, but it doesn't really interfere with your emotions. There's less physiological reactivity, so that means that you have less markers of physiological stress, but also a quicker return to just regular emotional neutrality following a stressor. It improved mood states, lowered intensity and frequency of negative effects. And by the way, just to quickly mention, all of these studies as I said previously, some of them use some specific meditation interventions. Some of them also use a control group. Some of them don't. Some of them use an active control group where people are undergoing a sham meditation, and they're being compared to people going an actual type of meditation. Some of them are longitudinal, with meaning over a longer period of time. So this is an issue right now in mindfulness science, is that we don't really have a structured, clear way to go about it, but we still have studies that have come out which are showing remarkable results. Moving on, we have a reduced activation of the amygdala in response to emotional stimuli, which is really important. So this is not just negative emotional stimuli, this is all emotional stimuli, but it will be mainly for negative stimuli. So this means that even from a bottom up, just from the initial emotional appraisal, the amygdala is less likely to go, poo, 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 something's wrong here. So that means that the prefrontal cortex doesn't even need to dial it down because it's already reduced from the beginning. Now you also, this is something that's very interesting. So you have higher prefrontal cortical activation for beginner meditators, but not expert meditators. And the initial hypothesis is that the expert ones have developed such an automated emotional acceptance towards an experience that they don't actually engage as much in the top-down processing from the prefrontal cortex to the subcortical structures such as the amygdala. And this would kind of make sense, especially when coupled with this point about the initial reduced activation of the amygdala. So if the amygdala is already kind of quiet, you don't need to intervene with the prefrontal cortex to tell the amygdala, hey, quiet down. And for expert meditators, the amygdala would probably already be much more reduced in activation towards non-negative stimuli or towards stimuli that shouldn't really elicit that response. Yes, and there's obviously these changes that I mentioned previously. So actually, the ventromedial prefrontal cortex becomes stronger in terms of the amygdala connectivity, reduce thickness for the amygdala. And yeah, so this is actually quite cool. So what you have here is you have neuroprotective effects from brain neurotropic derived factor and glucocorticoids. So glucocorticoids are a sort of stress response marker, and BNDF is something that promotes cell growth, cell plasticity, and is generally something that people as they age tend to have less and less of. And it seems that meditation actually helps maintain BNDF and promote BNDF. And another cool thing is there's enhanced hippocampal gray matter density. So the hippocampus is sort of related to memory encoding, but also plays a role in emotional regulation. So yeah, again, sorry for this wall of text. I just wanted to go through some really important findings that we're already having from this. So we spoke about emotion. We'll quickly go through attention as well, because this is another important aspect of writing a dissertation. It's not just that it's stressful, but it's that you have to focus while you're writing the dissertation. And there's three main types of attention that people talk about when they talk about attention. So you have initially, let's talk about executive control. So this one here. So this is also known as conflict monitoring. So this is essentially means you have to remove all interfering stimuli and just look at the thing that you care about. So you might have other information coming in, but you have to tune it out and focus on the thing you need to focus on. Orienting, on the other hand, is about using the outside stimuli to focus on the thing that's salient at the moment. So if you see a cheetah in your environment, you have to focus on the cheetah. And orienting attention helps you orient your attention towards the cheetah. Executive control helps you block out other stimuli that might interfere with your attention towards the cheetah. And then you have alerting, which is kind of unique and interesting because alerting sort of refers to the idea of just being aware and present. But it's still a type of attention because you could go through life sort of mindless and lost in thought and do things on autopilot. And you could have orienting and executive control, but without having alerting. So there was a A&T test designed, which is still in use. It's really useful. So it measures all three different types of attention. And some people have been able to sort of check whether people that don't meditate have any influences on this ANT after a meditation intervention. And it would be interesting to go through and see if it does help. So it seems that even neurologically, it does, and psychologically as well. So we have improved conflict monitoring. There's some enhanced activation in prefrontal cortical structures and higher dose valuable prefrontal cortical activation. If you remember, the DLPFC is actually less activated in depression. And it seems that through meditation, the functional activation increases, which is a pretty major thing because that could mean that it sort of removes one of the neural markers for depression. There's reduced attentional blink. So this is sort of moments where you're just not paying attention to anything, and they're actually quite common, even though you just don't notice them. Improved alerting in long-term meditators. So you have to be meditating for a while to actually maintain a constant awareness of the present moment. Improved orienting in all. This is, I thought, something interesting. So mindfulness-based stress reduction seems to sometimes not show effects for attention, but it does show so for emotional regulation. We don't really know why. We don't really know what the difference is there. Plenty of positive symptom improvements for ADHD. And yeah, so the proposed model here is basically that initially, as you start meditating, you really improve your conflict monitoring and orienting, which these benefits come on quite quickly, and they're quite useful in writing a dissertation because they help you tune out negative or not negative, but noisy stimuli that you don't really care about in the moment. And then later on, as you keep meditating, you also get improved alerting, so you're actually just more aware and more alert in your day-to-day life. Now what would be interesting, and this I'll just go through quickly because it's a lot to take in. So this is just functional neuroimaging meta-analysis. Functional activity of the brain. This relates to how much a brain region is activated during certain tasks and how often it activates. Of key importance, and you should go through this in your own time if you're more interested, but of key importance is this reference here, which shows greater DLPFC activation during emotional executive processing. So again, if you recall, DLPFC was less activated in depression, but following meditation, it seems that it activates further. We also have an enhanced activation of the ventrolateral prefrontal cortex and enhanced connectivity with the amygdala. So if you remember, the generalized anxiety disorder is heavily marked by weaker connections from the PFC to the amygdala, but it seems that through meditating, you actually get improved connectivity from the PFC to the amygdala. So this is again quite important. And there's plenty of other things to read through here, which you can do so if you're interested. And then there's also structural changes. So you don't just have changes in functional activity, but also in the actual underlying structure of the brain and how the cells are connected to each other and how many cells are in certain region and so on and so forth. So this is obviously quite serious, and most things induce structural brain changes. So our main concern is, does meditation induce brain changes that we wish to have? And it does seem that it does. So again, I would strongly direct you to read through all of this in your own time if you're more interested. But to sort of close up, something that is also quite interesting to discuss, because we've seen sort of the macro in terms of the cognitive effects. So we've looked at behavior, we've looked at emotion and attention. We've seen the meso, we've seen how the brain changes in terms of functional connectivity and in terms of structure. But we've now looked at the micro, and the micro is genes. Now, this diagram is sort of outdated because it shows a sort of bottom-up link, which is a unidirectional, whereas right now we would think that things are actually a lot more interconnected. And changes in attention will bring about changes in the genes and gene expression, and changes in the brain will also do that, and so on and so forth. So it's not really just a one-direction relationship, it's actually pluridirectional. So let's look at epigenetics, and let's look at how meditation actually influences your genetics. So this is the field that's currently less and least researched in meditation. But this interesting paper looked at expert meditators, control meditators. So these are people who have never meditated but are now undergoing an 8-week meditation practice, and control non-meditators. So these are people who have never meditated and will not be undergoing any sort of meditation practice. And there are very intense and large scale basal gene expressions in the people that meditate. And what was also interesting was that there were some gene expressions that were found in the expert meditators and in the control meditators, but not in the control not meditators. So these genetic expression changes would be only brought about by meditating. Now, there were some that the experimentators also had, actually quite a considerable amount. So in order to actually, you get an initial gene expression change if you start meditating for 8 weeks, as the study showed. But then if you keep going, and these experimentators had about a 9.5 year average of meditating. So if you keep going and you keep meditating for a while, you actually really start to restructure certain genetic expressions. And these relate to greater stress reduction and anti-inflammation, which is quite important. So there's plenty of stories of people who've switched to meditating and managed to shed off chronic stress, managed to shed off IBS even, which is quite crazy to think about, or other sort of autoimmune diseases. Now, again, I'm not trying to flag a meditation as an all cure for everything, but it's certainly something to consider and something to research and look into. And as I said, more research is needed, but preliminary results. So this is a small meta-analysis of 3 studies. I'm not even sure if I can call it a meta-analysis, which shows how meditation and other yogic practices can bring about similar results. Okay, so in summary, if you invest 3 minutes a day towards meditating, it will most literally change your life for the better. Um, I think a lot of people think to themselves, I don't have time to meditate, or I don't know how to meditate. To saying I don't have time to meditate, I strongly disagree. You can find 1 minute in your day in which you can meditate, and you can do that 1 minute for a month, and then you can maybe find another minute. And it's an investment that pays off incredibly well. You you essentially, by investing this 1 minute, you gain so many more minutes, and you also start enjoying your life to its fullest. Now, in terms of learning how to meditate, there's plenty of resources out there. This is the Edinburgh University Yoga Society, and this is Budsock, also for Edinburgh University. This is Kitty, who is also presenting today, and this is the chaplaincy. So these are all University of Edinburgh based resources that you can access to meditate more. Um, you also have podcasts, apps, books. This is a great book to read if you want to learn how to meditate. I think it's perfect for an introduction into meditation. And also, there's plenty of free resources online on YouTube just for guided meditations. Um, so yeah, hopefully I've given you a short insight into why you should meditate, and a short insight into how to meditate through these resources. I am very thankful for the time you've given me. And yeah, I'll pass on to Kitty. Thank you very much.